Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk Back. It's Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022. And I'm very happy today to have someone who is very well known in our area of Eastern Connecticut. I call her a star in the firmament of Eastern Connecticut. She's more interested in the graveyards than the stars, but that's okay. We will get to that. So let me introduce Faye Ringel. Hi,
Hello.
Faye.
Hello, Sheila. It's always good to see you and to be on your show.
It's great to have you. So we're here to talk about a special book that you've just written, Gothic Literature and the History of New England, Secrets of the Restless Dead. I'm going to get into all of that. We've got a nice long show to talk to you about it and see some images. But first, I have to tell people a little bit about you. I know you say it's boring for this long talk, but you have too many accomplishments. I'm sorry. We just have to mention them. We'll start with some of the others leading up to your being an author. You're a singer, you're an actress, you're a director, you're a performer. You do a lot of work in the Jewish community. You can run a Hebrew service in your synagogue. You have your own shows. You're an expert on all World War II songs and do a wonderful job singing all of those wonderful songs. And what else? You are a professor emerita, now to get to the academics, professor emerita from the United States Coast Guard, where you taught humanities for many years, retired with many accolades, right? And you have a huge interest in the Gothic world, in the history of New England as it relates to all of these issues. Okay, so what did I leave out, Faye? What something that I left out? I'm sure you've published many articles. You published another book before this one. What else?
Well, just that I am a lifelong resident of New England, born and bred here in Norwich, and living now in the house in which I grew up.
That's fantastic. And we're going to talk about that because your Norwich roots have a lot to do with your interest in the Gothic literature and all of the occult and so forth. But before we do, I want vocabulary. I want a definition. I want to know what Gothic literature means. And I want to know Secrets of the Restless Dead. I want to know why the dead are restless. So would you handle those two first before we get into it?
Wow, that's a big question. Many, many volumes have been devoted to defining the Gothic. And of course, what most people think of when they hear the word Gothic is young people with white makeup and black lipstick and dead black hair and dead black eyes. And that's what they think of when they hear goth. And actually, there is a connection from today's popular culture, goth, all the way back to the origins of Gothic literature. And when we say Gothic literature, we're usually referring to what became known as the first Gothic boom of the 18th century in Old England, where in the midst of what we call the Enlightenment, the period of philosophy and literature and science, the scientific revolution, bringing knowledge to people and in fact moving away from the religious worldview that had governed humanity. And in the very middle of that, people began to say, reason isn't everything. And most of all, reason isn't always fun. It's not always fun to read realistic novels. It's fun to imagine, to exercise our imagination into what might be. And so you have the very beginnings of what came to be called Gothic romance. And in Gothic romance, you had castles and dungeons and the Inquisition and all those scary things that we associate with the Middle Ages. In the 18th century, the Middle Ages was kind of out of fashion. The term Gothic cathedral, which we now think of as the pinnacle of architecture, was a label that 18th century critics put on buildings like that, saying, oh, they're just barbaric, like the Goths who invaded and brought down the ancient Roman Empire. No, those are no good architecturally. And the same way, the literature of the Middle Ages was called Gothic because it was thought to be primitive and barbaric. And so when you had a Gothic romance, this was what happened was that these writers said, no, those are precisely the things we'd like to see more of in our lives. We'd like to see more romance and less reason. And thus the Gothic began.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so, how did that concept of more interesting, less reason, combine with the more of the occult, the restless dead? Why? How are they coming up and connected with the Gothic literature?
Well, in the New World, of course, because this is a book about American literature, in the New World, we had no Middle Ages. There were no castles until they were built in imitation of the Middle Ages. But what we did have was a heritage of the Puritans, something I will talk about more later, and a legacy of hidden secrets. And many of those secrets just refused to stay buried. And so the reason I said Restless Dead is twofold. One is that the Gothic genre, another word I'll come back to, often features ghosts, whether they are ghosts that are believed in by the people in the story or ghosts that are not believed in by the people of the story. Ghosts and other kinds of revenants, returners, vampires, ghouls, zombies feature very prominently in Gothic literature. But the metaphoric dead are also there. The restless dead are the real people, the indigenous people, the enslaved peoples whose deaths, who refuse to stay dead, but whose secrets keep emerging into the light of day.
Very interesting. So now, Faye, we need to connect all of that with your life. You grew up in Norwich, and Norwich has an interesting history, as so many what I call gritty cities, industrial cities that have passed their prime in some way do, right? You grew up there. Tell us how you came to be interested in this field of literature and how living in Norwich really impelled that for you.
Well, thank you, Sheila. It's something I could talk about forever. I like to say that I've been collecting these stories for 60 plus years because one of the forces that impelled me to this interest in local history and also local supernatural legends was attending summer camps run by Dick Kurland, who is the great local historian and storyteller, and who was, of course, much younger then, just as I was, but he told us the most wonderful stories. And he took some of us to visit other storytellers. And we learned about the Native American legends. And we learned the ghost stories and the stories of haunted houses, as well as the funnier stories from the folklore of the area. So I was fascinated from the beginning. At the same time, I was always interested in the Middle Ages and the romance, the romantic stories of the Middle Ages. Excuse me. I showed up at kindergarten with a copy of The Child's King Arthur and was promptly told, kindergartners don't know how to read such hard books. And it was my first disillusionment of not being believed because I had been reading on my own for several years before then. So I was fascinated by the idea of the Middle Ages and the idea of local legends and colonial stories and so on from that early an age. Eventually, I came to realize that my interest in the Middle Ages was shared by writers beginning in the 18th century and what we called medieval revival movements. So that was something that I studied and read and enjoyed and lived for all the years. Now, Norwich in particular, however, the other aspect of the Gothic that I haven't mentioned yet is that there's the term Gothic mode or Gothic way of thought is applied to non-supernatural kinds of themes, whether they are dysfunctional families, cruelty, serial killers, the hereditary secrets and lies and so on. And those are all part of the Gothic mode. And Norwich seemed to have those definitely. And yet another, well, how could I forget? The Gothic mode is always characterized by a preoccupation with decline and fall, that the past was better than the present and definitely better than the future. And Norwich was a city that had a glorious past. It had two periods of glory. Through the colonial period, when Norwich was a thriving trading center, and then again in the 19th century, when Norwich was a thriving industrial center. And the monuments of those times, such as the Kenema Mills or the beautiful colonial era houses in Norwich Town, and the ancient burial ground of Norwich Town, where I used to hang out when I was, and where I still hang out, in fact. And all of those things just made it inevitable that I would want to study the Gothic and write about it and read everything I could get my hands on.
Wow. So I think what we need to do now is go through a little bit of introduction to each part of your book. And then from there, we have some images that will get you deeper into explanations of these things. So Gothic literature and the history of New England, your book gives a compendium of a beautiful history and discussion of all of the American books written about the Gothic literature or Gothic literature books themselves. And so tell me how you divided up the book. I know the first section was called Gothic Origins. I think you've kind of discussed that with us a bit, right? Do you want to talk about the origins a little bit more before you get to the second section, which is Puritans and the Haunted Frontier, which is terrific?
Right. No, I will only add that this is a short book. It's meant to be really an introduction to this subject. It's only about 100 pages long. And it's designed for, I hope, a general audience as well as a scholarly audience. And so I had to pick an organizing principle, and I could have just gone chronologically, but I didn't want to. I wanted to, first I did have to explain, as I just did, some of these definitions and after students need to know where they're situated. But then I organized it around several major hidden secrets, several major instances of the restless dead. And a great literary critic, Leslie Fiedler, long ago said that American Gothic has two great sources of guilt or secrets. One is the treatment of the native peoples, and the other is slavery and the legacy of racism. And those two are prevalent in New England as well, adding a third being the legacy of the Puritan theocracy. We have to remember that that New England, in Connecticut and Massachusetts particularly, was a pure theocracy with an established church that in Connecticut lingered until 1818, after the Constitution, after the Bill of Rights. It was still the Congregational Church, descendants of the Puritans, was the only established church in Connecticut. So that's the first section is that the legacy of the Puritan theocracy, in particular the witch trials, the witch belief, demonic possession, and those themes. And the frontier, the treatment of the native peoples in what's called frontier Gothic. And then the legacy of race and racism I cover later on.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the, you say secrets. Now, what I found interesting is some of those secrets are still sitting today without being expiated, apologized for, or whatever. I mentioned in your book, you mentioned Brown University, Yale, and Harvard. They all have secrets of their founders being either slave owners or traders in opium, right? How do we reconcile those things? That's some of the secrets you talk about, isn't it?
Yes. When I first began this study, those were truly secret. I mean, literally nobody talked about them. It's really only in the last few years that universities have reluctantly begun to come to grips with their past. And their first instinct is still to cover up and stonewall. It's really only in the last few years in the Black Lives Matter movement that there's been demands to bring these out into the open. Because this is a short book, I don't talk about the campaign for reparations. But right here in Norwich, we have an example of a woman who's had a lawsuit against Harvard to give her back the photographs of her enslaved ancestors that have been held and used and published and benefited by Harvard all of these years. So this is very much an ongoing issue.
Yeah, interesting. So let's get to the other aspect we started with in your second chapter, the Puritans and the frontier, the fear of the frontier, the fear of the indigenous. Talk about how that influenced all of the literature of the time.
Yes, this is really interesting because one of the newest kinds of scholarship of the Gothic is what's called the eco-Gothic or eco-criticism, that looks at literature and the environment and the intersection of literature and the environment. And the first example of a people being frightened, so frightened by their environment that they set out to fix it by cutting it all down is the Puritan settlers of New England, because there was a strong belief that Satan dwelled in the wilderness. And what did you have all over New England but trees and wilderness? And so the fear of the wilderness itself was very strong among the Puritans. And then, of course, by extension, who lived in the wilderness but the native peoples, who many Puritans believed were devil worshippers just because of that they interpreted Indian spirituality as they saw it as strict devil worship. And so it was yet another reason to hate the native peoples. So it's a bad kind of combination. And when I talk about Puritan texts, including sermons and poems and accounts, diaries, letters, and so on, that's not Gothic literature, but it's what some critics call taproot texts. Taproot texts refer to the source for later literature, that whether it's the Arthurian myths of the Middle Ages or the Puritan sermons and beliefs, which later are drawn upon by authors who are consciously either anti-Puritan or pro-Puritan. And we'll talk about some of those later.
Yeah. And so, of course, just a few words before we get into it later, the most important component of all of that, one that's most famous to most people, are the witch trials and the whole thing in Salem and in Massachusetts, but all over New England, right?
Yes.
The witch trials.
The New England witch belief is no secret. It's been very well documented, particularly in Massachusetts. It's a whole range of, and that's why I have one gigantic footnote with all of the many texts that people could go to, and I felt no need to summarize. However, Connecticut's witch belief is still less studied, less known. I've been talking to libraries about the Connecticut witch belief for 35 years, and I will always encounter people at these library discussions who have never heard of it. Even now, Massachusetts has issued pardons to those who were executed for witchcraft. Connecticut has not. There have been several efforts to pardon the Connecticut witch victims, and they have come to naught.
Wow. All right. Anything else we want to say as an introduction on that portion of your book? Of course, in each section of the book, you do mention many of the books the literature that has been written, and we're going to show some of that later and talk in more detail. But if not, we're going to go on to the section where you talk about the domestic Gothic, the supernatural, naturalistic spiritualism. Can you talk a few minutes about that?
Sure. In the 19th century, there was a golden age of women writing ghost stories. It was possible for women to publish ghost stories and to do quite well commercially. But in those ghost stories, they were dealing with real life, not supernatural issues such as child abuse, partner abuse, the being oppressed by, as we call it, oppressed by the patriarchy, madness, the treatment of madness. And all of those could be expressed through stories of the supernatural, which people could dismiss as, oh, well, it's just a story. At the same time, in the mid-19th century, you had the rise of spiritualism as a religion. That is a woman-centered religion in which the mediums were mostly women. And it's not often known that the original women's rights movement in America, 1848, most of the pioneering women in that movement were spiritualists. And that the very table on which the Seneca Falls Declaration of Women's Rights was signed was used as a seance table.
Wow.
And so the spiritualism was in its way a feminist movement. At the same time, it produced a great deal of popular literature that had not much read today, but it was very popular then.
So interesting. So interesting to hear about that. Of course, last year we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. We were talking about Seneca Falls, and no one mentioned the spiritualism. We were only talking about the intellectualism and the fight for women's rights. And look at that additional interesting component that you bring to it with that information. It's fantastic to think about it. It really is. To think that you could combine the intellectualism with the spiritualism. They're not incompatible, are they?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's so important. And so then, of course, you already touched on it a bit, the enduring racism and then the legacy of slavery and all of those secrets and things that we're still really have not recovered from in our culture today. That played a big role in Gothic literature, right?
Yes. Whether writers dealt with it directly, or it really took until or more often indirectly. It really took until the 20th century for writers of color, particularly, to begin to grapple with those themes. The most famous, perhaps, being Toni Morrison's Beloved. We're still waiting for the great New England novel of dealing with the legacy of slavery. Still waiting.
Interesting. And after you did that, then you got into more current times, and you mentioned many books, but you also talked about culture. You talked about the movies and poetry and other methods of expression. So just give us a little bit of what's happening on the current scene. You mentioned somebody like a Stephen King. You mentioned Lovecraft and the important influence that he had, and so on.
Well, I guess we can do those with the slides, right?
We certainly can.
Through those, yeah.
Certainly can.
But I was able. The first book that I wrote on this subject was researched in the early 90s and published in 1995. And at that time, it was not strong in the popular culture. I was pretty much breaking new ground. But these days, you've got graphic novels such as Lock and Key that deals with New England Gothic themes. You've got movies. You have movies like The Witch, a folk horror movie that is one of the first to accurately represent the witch belief. And you have TV shows like Lovecraft Country, which came out just as I was writing this book. I mean, it is truly amazing that every day seems to, I feel as though I maybe am part of a trend for the first time in my life.
Well, Faye, you mentioned that, and I'm wondering, since you said that the Gothic came about as a feeling in the culture that things were going in decline, do you think that our age today, where we have lots of problems, and many historians are thinking that we may be on the decline as a culture, do you think the interest in these Gothic themes might have some connection with that? I'm just surmising.
Absolutely. And in fact, talk about up to date. I meet every Sunday on Zoom with the International Gothic Scholars. And we are just now assembling a volume of essays called Troubling Gothic, and talking about contentious times and decline, exactly. And my proposal, the article that I haven't written it yet, I haven't even sent in the proposal, but it will be on the Gothic and apocalypse, Gothic at the end of the world. So
there you go. Yeah, we're in that mindset now. We really are. So
yes,
it's
we are.
fascinating that it's so popular. All right, let's turn to this slideshow. Can you see that?
Yes.
All right, and there you are. Faye Ringgold, The Gothic Literature and History of New England, Secrets of the Restless Dead. Now, Faye, tell me about your book cover, because that must have some significance.
Yes, it does. Partly, there's nothing that symbolizes the Gothic in New England better than an old tombstone. But this is a really unique old tombstone. It's one of the only record that we have of an enslaved African person having a marked tombstone, a marked grave. Norwich has a few from a slightly later period. This is from the mid-18th century, and it was carved by an enslaved African-American carver named Pompey Stevens, who worked in the Stevens, his master's, stone carving yard in Newport, Rhode Island. And he writes on this that he cut this for his brother Cuffy.
Wow.
The dates. And the winged skull motif, so common in Puritan gravestones. You can see them all over New England. You can see them in the Norwich Town burial ground. In this case, it's not a skull. If you look at it, it's definitely as a winged soul. It looks like a human face. If you might even think it's an African-American face that has the wings.
Interesting.
So I mentioned this is the keystone text of the mid-1760s. Horace Walpole, a politician, an architect, he built himself a castle called the Strawberry Hill, and he dreamed of the Middle Ages. Literally, he said, I had a dream and I had to write it down. And there was this novel, which has remained in print, and it's still readable today. It's unlike some of the Gothic novels of the 18th and early 19th century are pretty much unreadable to us. But this has a real narrative drive and excitement to it, and definitely still worth reading.
So is that why so many of our haunted houses and the house in Psycho look like this castle, have similar kind of architecture?
Yes. So that's the other thing. Think of the painting American Gothic by Grant Wood that shows the guy with the pitchfork and his wife and so on. And behind them is what looks like an upward striving spire, like the ones in this illustration. American Gothic or Gothic revival style was just that. It was a vernacular architecture style that swept the United States, and we have lots of examples of it here in Norwich. And it was an attempt to render in wood what was done by castles in stone.
Interesting. Norwich.
Yes. So Norwich is lucky in having had this been chronicled by this wonderful historian, Frances Manwaring Calkins, who also wrote a similar book about New London. And luckily for us, well, she at first, she wasn't a trained historian, so she tended to write everything down. So she included a lot of things that today we'd class as legends and folklore, right alongside the extremely detailed dates and places and documented history. So many of the stories that I tell and that have been retold about Norwich are found in her book.
Sure. Okay. Lydia Sigourney. We did a show about the women authors that you did last year. She was one of them.
Yes, it was hard to believe, but it was 2 years ago, June.
Right.
That it was a show all about what I call the uppity women writers of Norwich. So yes,
Right.
Lydia Sigourney is known to posterity as the sweet singer of Hartford. She is best known for her kind of sentimental poems. In fact, I think you have one of the death of an infant poem on a slide. No, one more maybe.
There it is. There it is.
Yes.
We'll go back.
Yes.
Yeah.
Her manuscript in her beautiful handwriting. She loved to write about dead babies, and in fact, in her later years, people made fun of her for that. But she took it seriously, and we have to remember that the Puritan religion still believed in infant damnation. They believed that babies who were born and if they weren't baptized and they died, they were going straight to hell. And even if they were baptized, even though they had committed no sins, they could still be predestined to hell because of original sin. And it was really only she was one of the first to push back against that and to write poems that comforted the mothers and that pushed back against the concept of original sin. So going back to Lydia, she was born and grew up in Norwich. And one more.
There she is.
As you can see her, she became very, very famous. But while she was in Norwich, she attempted to run a girls' school at which she had the radical notion of teaching mathematics and science to young ladies. The school did not do well. The parents pulled their kids out. This is not what they wanted their daughters to be learning. Then she attempted to run a Sunday school for free children of color. Norwich, by 1810, 1812, had a sizable population of former slaves or their children, as well as still some enslaved people. Hard as it is to believe, even though Connecticut did abolish slavery, there was what they called a grandfather clause saying that those born into slavery had to remain there unless they were either bought out or freed. And so she may have even included some enslaved children in her school. And all we know, it was at the Second Congregational Church on Church Street. The building today stands, but it's not the building of that time. The Second Congregational Church eventually became Beth Jacobs Synagogue, but it is the church referred to on Church Street. And she had this Sunday school. And something happened. We don't know. It's one of those things that was covered up so thoroughly that we still don't know what happened. But she felt compelled to leave Norwich immediately and move to Hartford.
Oh,
lucky for her and her publications, because she did eventually publish not only her poetry, but essays and books about teaching, her memoirs. She was known all over the world. And among the causes that she was involved with was the treatment of the native peoples. She wrote a wonderful poem about the dedication of the Mohegan Church, which still stands on Mohegan lands. She was an abolitionist. She supported abolitionist causes.
Interesting. You brought up something so interesting that I think we sometimes gloss over. Just because the South had its economy in most ways based on slavery, doesn't mean that there weren't slaves in the North. And we kind of gloss over that. You just brought it up in relation to Connecticut, having passed the law abolishing it. There was the grandfather clause. There were still slaves in the North, weren't there?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Of all the New England states, only Vermont never had legal slavery. There were no slaves in Vermont. But it was not as vital to the economy as it was in the South. But in South County, Rhode Island, there were many connections with the American South, and there were plantations. In fact, people don't. The term Providence Plantations was finally taken out of the state of Rhode Island's name.
Absolutely right. People didn't realize that it had a connotation with slavery. Maybe they did, or maybe they didn't. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let's go on to Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Perkins Gilman, who another of Norwich's uppity women writers. Her story, The Giant Wisteria, which is illustrated here, was a straight-out ghost story, very much related to Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which we'll talk about a little in a bit. But her most famous story, which defines the domestic Gothic, is The Yellow Wallpaper. And the house that may have inspired that story is the house in which Gilman lived to nearly the end of her life, and in which, by coincidence, so did Lydia Sigourney. And that is the house on Upper Washington Street that is now called the Lathrop Manor B&B. That building, I like to say, has so much history in it that it should export it. Benedict Arnold lived in that house for a while. He did his apprenticeship as a pharmacist with Dr. Daniel Lathrop, who owned the house. I mean,
it should have a historical plaque.
Well, it should. It definitely should. And it shouldn't be, as it is right now, involved in a great controversy over an illegal B&B that's being run out of it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, here back. All right, the frog. Oh, I love this guy.
So Norwich doesn't have a monopoly on folk tales and legends. Thanks to the Frog Bridge in Willimantic, the story of the Wyndham Frog fight is now better known. Although I will bet that an awful lot of people who drive over that bridge have no idea why there are gigantic golden-eyed frogs sitting on top of spools. They might notice.
Yeah, they publicized it a bit when the bridge was first inaugurated. After it was built, there was a little publicity in the newspapers about it. But otherwise, you're right. Most people have no idea what's going on with the frogs.
But it's a long story. I don't think I better tell the whole Wyndham Frog fight story, but just let it be known that there was a series of what we might call panics, paranoid. I talk about Puritan paranoia in the 18th century, fear of being invaded. This happened around the time of the French and Indian War. Before that, there were similar panics around the time of the Salem witch trials, in which people really believed that they were being invaded, and they weren't. And that's the core of but Wyndham owned its story. There's a frog on the town seal, and now there's the giant frogs on the bridges.
Great. Okay.
So Cotton Mather and his father, Increase Mather, play a large role in the book because they're the ultimate taproot texts for the horrors of the witch trials, of the persecution of Quakers, of the persecution of Jews. And for that matter, people don't even, Cotton Mather wrote about the Pequot War of 1636. You can, if you go to the museum, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum at Foxwoods, you can get the story of it there. But in his version of it, it's one of the first uses of the word genocide in America. He believed that it was a good thing that the Pequot nation would be wiped out and either sold into slavery, killed, or enslaved in the United States, in the Americas, or sold into the Caribbean islands.
Well, you know what's so interesting, Faye? we're taught in elementary school and beyond that the Puritans came here for religious freedom. But I don't know if we concentrate as much on the fact that they didn't give any religious freedom to anyone else. As you said, they were a theocracy with all of the hatreds and superstitions and fears of the native peoples and of the land and so forth, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's no secret anymore. If we want to go on to Hawthorne. Just speaking of which, yes, everyone who I would think who might be watching this program knows that that the Mohegans are still very much around. What James Fenimore Cooper did, he was not a New Englander, he was a New Yorker. He took the legends and stories that took place in the wars, first among the Indians and then the Indians and the colonists, and transposed them up to upstate New York during the time of the French and Indian War, about 100 years later. And the character Uncas, last of the Mohegans, has very little to do with the sachem Uncas, who was actually, as Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel will tell you, the first of the Mohegans. He was someone who founded the Mohegan tribe as it came to be. So, but in any case, this by the time Cooper was writing, he was pretty sure there weren't any Mohegans around, and there were both in New York and Connecticut, and it was part of a whole trend of romanticizing. The flip side of fear, of course, is to make a people so romanticized that you ignore the fact that of their actual treatment. So the myth of the noble savage was very much a part of American culture, American literature.
Yeah. Now, Mohegans, are they the same kind? I thought so.
Same,
okay,
just
right.
different spelling. So when I said that the Puritan attitudes and paranoia and theocracy were no secret, anyone who reads Nathaniel Hawthorne, the descendant of one of the witch trial judges, can find it. Young Goodman Brown, a story that lots of kids are still assigned in school, in one short story pretty much covers everything that you want to know about all of the above. And he felt enormous guilt for his ancestors' beliefs and the death of all those innocent people.
Yeah.
And so he wrote Young Goodman Brown, and then he wrote The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter, and the Scarlet Letter, published at the mid-19th century, was his way of expiation of his ancestors' sins, but also exploring the idea of what happens when something is kept secret and it just can't be kept down. The Scarlet Letter is not based on any one historical incident, and actually the witch trials are off stage. But the persecution of this one woman who has a child out of wedlock, the hypocritical minister who won't admit that he's the father, and then the really Gothic figure in it is Chillingworth, the aptly named Chillingworth, who is an alchemist, who is a kind of acts as a demonic and evil spirit who torments the minister because he knows his secret. And interestingly, Chillingworth may have been based on real-life alchemists in New London, Connecticut.
Oh, really?
Yes, another whole story. Hawthorne's other Gothic romance, he calls it, is The House of Seven Gables, which this is an actual picture of it. You can visit it in Salem. It was not Hawthorne's own house, but an elderly relative of his lived in it, and he learned all these stories from her. And he creates a wonderful story that, unlike most Gothic novels, and really including The Scarlet Letter, has a happy ending. He allows, and what's the happy ending? His hero and heroine are able to escape from Salem, and they get on a train and head west. And that is going to get them out of Salem. And it's this, they're going to move into the modern world. And Hawthorne did pretty much the same thing. The years that he was not popular in Salem when he was living there, as who would be? He's revealing the secrets they would rather have covered up. He left Salem. He went to Concord. He had a family. He was able to get together with his buddies, the Transcendentalists, and to have a real friendship with Herman Melville, and in general have a pretty good life. And this, the Blithedale Romance, another romance on the supernatural and spiritualism. He was not a believer, although many in his family were. He did report some ghost encounters. He was at least open-minded about the possibility of ghosts, but he was not himself a spiritualist. His wife and her family were. And Blithedale Romance is a kind of satirical look at the communes that his buddies in the Transcendentalist movement lived on, and he was never really one of them in that. He wasn't quite the back to nature guy as Thoreau was. And so, witch belief, Salem, that lots and lots of examples of the literature about the witch trials, such as Arthur Miller's The Crucible. But as far as I know, only one novel about the witch belief in Connecticut, and it was written as a middle grade novel. It won the Newbery Prize. It's Elizabeth George Spears' The Witch of Blackbird Pond, and it is both accurate historically and kind of inaccurate in other ways. But it does feature actual people who actually lived. The inaccurate part is that there's no portrayal of it is a YA book. The heroine gets away, nobody gets hanged, and in the real life, the character it's based on did die.
Young adults.
Yes. So I believe there's a self-published novel fairly recently about that trial, but as far as I know, yes. So.
The Crucible.
Yeah, I will talk about The Crucible. Sheila, please mute yourself when you're not talking.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the most famous piece of fiction about the witch trials has to be Arthur Miller's drama, The Crucible. Still produced in many high schools and still popular today, still read. Miller himself writes at the beginning of every edition of this book, this is not historical. This is inspired by history, but is not exactly historical. However, it certainly gives you a very good portrayal of not so much the history and facts of the witch trial as the attitude, this idea of families being torn apart, of neighbors reporting their neighbors, of people being asked to name names and being persecuted in that way. It's not coincidental that Miller wrote it during the period that we now call the McCarthy witch hunts.
Right.
So that it's not, it was, what's strange is that it was produced on Broadway in 1953 and was very popular. And it's like nobody seemed to notice.
Right.
Sheila, I'm going to ask you to mute once again. Oh dear. Yes. So Emily Dickinson is perhaps America's most famous poet. And she's not usually the one that you think of as an example of Gothic literature, but really, in many ways, she was. And this quote that Sheila has here is perhaps her most famous quote along those lines. Nature is a haunted house, but art is a house that tries to be haunted. The this comes from a letter rather than a poem, but she has many poems that use imagery of ghosts and ghouls and goblins and the dead. And of course, she herself was preoccupied with, as I mentioned with Lydia Sigourney, this pushing back against the doctrine of infant damnation. Her even though she grew up in a Puritan household, and she did not share in those beliefs, and she believed in I shall say, a much, well, what came to be known as Unitarian Universalism, a more universalist religion, and not a theocracy, and not predestination. And she was not herself a spiritualist, but again, many of her friends and relatives were. And again, it's really interesting to read her poems against the background of Gothic themes. Okay, maybe the next one. Yeah, just a few quick words about this because we're going to be running out of time. An interesting novel by Catherine Maria Sedgwick, an ancestor of the actress Kira Sedgwick, by the way. And she wrote this lovely romance set in Western Massachusetts, elements of the frontier Gothic and of the Gothic romance of the time. Next one. Yeah, and Sheila, please mute. This is part of a group having to do with slavery. Benito Sereno, the novella by Herman Melville, most famous for Moby Dick, which deals with the encounter similar to the Amistad incident, where there had been a mutiny on a slave ship. But this one comes from the narrative of Captain Delano, and he transforms it really into a meditation on the way that that even the best intentioned whites could not understand the depths and horrors of slavery. And the most famous novel about slavery, we have to look at Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, born in Connecticut, but she never wrote about the slavery that was going on in Connecticut at the time that she was born, in Litchfield, Connecticut, where there were still enslaved people. And it was not until she left New England, went to Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio, where she learned of the Underground Railway and the story that became Eliza crossing the ice, that Harriet Beecher Stowe came to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, written in Maine, in fact, where there was slavery, but not mentioned, but that Lincoln referred to her as the little lady who started the Great War. One of the slaves in Connecticut was James Mars, who wrote an autobiography, The Life of James Mars, a slave born and sold in Connecticut. Despite this book cover, it is not in print from any reputable publisher, but you can read it online. And I only discovered it when researching this book. This is something that should be required in every school in Connecticut. He writes so beautifully and so heartbreakingly of his life in slavery. And he says in his introduction, why did I write this book? I'm an old man. It's the 1860s. And there's a war going on. And people say to me, oh, but there were never slaves in Connecticut. They say it to me, he writes. So that's how effective the cover-up was. H.P. Lovecraft, got a bunch of them. You can go ahead and kind of just go through them. I could talk for hours about Howard Phillips Lovecraft, whose tombstone is here, buried in Swan Point Cemetery. When I lived in Providence for graduate school, I used to do Lovecraft tours. He so completely enshrined all of the anxieties of the Puritans that I've talked about. He was certainly in the tradition of Hawthorne. Unlike Hawthorne, he didn't feel guilty about that. He treasured his Puritan ancestors, and he felt that while the Puritans themselves were Gothic, they were an inspiration to him, a literary inspiration. he really believed that the peak of humanity took place in the 18th century, that it had been all downhill after that. However, he bought into all of the racialist beliefs of his time. He really believed that there were inferior races, which to him was pretty much everyone who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. At the same, and this was expressed in his fiction as fears of invasion from outer space, except the space aliens were, like, in his mind, these inferior races that somehow were going to take over the world. I could talk about Lovecraft forever, but that maybe that's for another show, because in my book I describe the reactions to Lovecraft. Yes. Yes.
I am Providence. What does that mean?
Oh, he actually wrote that in several letters. He believed that he was so identified with Providence, its history, its secrets, its decline, its fall, its invasion by inferior races, that he believed he was like the spirit of Providence. And so his fans, this was only erected not after his death, but long after his death. His fans put that there. Shirley Jackson, you can't talk about New England Gothic without America's greatest woman writer of the Gothic, hands down, Shirley Jackson, who lived most of her life in New England, most famous for the story The Lottery, which is a kind of allegory of New England's treatment of outsiders and of, again, people relate it both to the witch persecution. Some people, it published right after World War II. Some relate it to the treatment of Jews. She related it to her own treatment as an outsider married to a Jewish professor in Bennington, Vermont. She was not stoned, but she was certainly shunned and looked on with great suspicion by the people of North Bennington, Vermont, where she lived. Most famous Gothic novel, The Haunting of Hill House, which has become a TV series recently that has very little to do with the book, but has a lot to do with Gothic New England. However, her novel is extremely worth reading, greatest Gothic novel of the 20th century, I think. Stephen King carried on the tradition in New England of looking toward the horrors of the New England past and incorporating them in his novels set in the present day or even in the future. Bag of Bones is his novel that explicitly deals with racism in New England and the legacy of that racism. It's one of he also, in the novel It, deals with the legacy of racism in Maine and elsewhere in New England. But It is a compendium of the folklore of real Maine, real Bangor, Maine, set in his imagined Bangor called Derry. And again, Stephen King also wrote an homage to Hawthorne in several places. Finally, it takes to the second decade of the 21st century for African-American writers and filmmakers to deal with some of these themes. Jordan Peele's Get Out is a strange combination of deadly serious and also kind of a parody of the cliches of horror films, and certainly worth watching. I can't recommend it highly enough. For it's setting not explicit, but it is apparently the suburban Connecticut. And let's see. And a good
finally place, the author of today.
Yeah, Paul Tremblay, a friend and an author of horror living in Massachusetts. His Survivor Song is about the horrors of the pandemic, published just before the pandemic and seemingly predicting it, but there it is. And his earlier one, A Head Full of Ghosts, returns to Jackson and to the demonic possession stories of Cotton Mather. So also a great New England Gothic story.
Okay, we're going to leave the slideshow, and we want to tell people, Faye, that that slideshow was just a very small representative sampling of so many of the literature that you have in your book, right? Just it's chock full
Yes.
of recommendations. Yes. And so I want you to kind of summarize. I want you to tell me, what is the thing that you most want to say to people when they ask you, what should I read about Gothic literature? What makes it so great? Why should I do it?
Wow, that's a hard one because um, the Gothic mode it goes beyond literature into life, into history. It's a way of, it's a worldview, and it's not a worldview that is comforting or comfortable. And yet it is a worldview that, as we said, seems to arise in contentious and difficult times. Um, I hardly know where to tell you to start, but actually I would start with short fiction. There's a wonderful anthology compiled by Joyce Carol Oates, herself a great writer of the American Gothic, called American Gothic Tales. And that's a good place to start. Some of these writers from New England, many of the writers from New England are represented in it. And there are there's an anthology, I don't even know where to start. I would start with short works, definitely.
Okay. But you don't have to share the worldview of the decline of the fear. You don't have to share the worldview of the Gothic thought in order to enjoy the books, in order to get entertainment from them, right?
No, definitely.
Absolutely. You don't share. You don't share. What is your worldview, Faye? Do you think as a culture we are on the decline, and that's why these books and these shows are so popular now?
I really do, but I'm a pessimist. I mean, I predicted this pandemic, and I've been pessimistic about it since it began, and now I'm really pessimistic about what's happening in Ukraine. And I find some kind of comfort in the in post-apocalyptic fiction and film, just because somebody survives and something survives. But it's I don't recommend that worldview to others.
I know, but because we like to read, we can lose ourselves in some of the problems. Isn't that the purpose of good art and good literature? To lose yourself, to learn something about yourself, to move on into the future, right? With some
Yes,
insights behind you. Yes. And of course,
absolutely.
you've been doing
Yes.
that. You've been doing that your whole life, your whole career, and that you can bury yourself. I hate to use the word bury but you can bury yourself in a book, in literature, in a poem, and to you that makes life worthwhile, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well put.
Absolutely. Well worth it. And it's very well worth having you as a guest and learning about this Gothic literature and history of New England. Faye is everywhere in Eastern Connecticut, especially Norwich. You can see her. Well, she'll be coming out soon when the pandemic is over. We know that, right? Hopefully that will be
Yeah.
soon. All
But
right.
meanwhile,
So
yes, you can find me on the internet.
you can find her on the internet, and you'll see her in the future. She'll be out there, and we'll take away your pessimism for the moment, and we'll be optimistic that things will be getting better all around, and our worldview will be looking up. Let's hope. Okay. Great to see you, Faye, and we'll see everybody next time on Talkback. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Sheila.